This is a recording summarising the training that we recently did out of our new Edit Support Strategies Inclusion Toolkit. Um, and the section that I did was on attachment, which is one of our very early sections of the toolkit. So I was describing how attachment is foundational for everything else that you want to do with the children in your setting, whether they have specific additional needs or not. And I described the secure and the insecure attachment cycle, or the secure and the disturbed attachment cycle. So, the secure attachment cycle for a baby um, developing their attachment in their earliest days is the baby will cry because they have discomfort or a need or a want, and they will be soothed by their attachment figure, their parent or primary carer, and they will be given something that meets their need. They'll be fed, or they'll be changed, or they will receive some interaction, or they'll be put down for a sleep, or whatever it is. And as that need is fulfilled, it brings about trust. So trust develops between the baby and their primary carer, and it also brings about something called attunement. So a baby has a need to regulate themselves through, it would usually be through the mother in the first instance, and the parents. So they're regulating their emotions through their primary carers. And as attunement between them builds, it's a positive cycle. So the parent gets to know what that kind of a cry usually means from the baby, or that kind of a response from the baby usually means, and they will give them what they need. And particularly, they'll give them that interaction that then will build attunement. They will mirror one another, and that will build up a sense of empathy, and all of the positives around an attachment developing will begin to occur. Where attachment is disturbed in some way or is insecure, develops insecurely, a baby will express their need or their want, or their discomfort, but many, many times, so not just on the odd occasion, but many, many times in a recurring cycle, that need won't be met appropriately. So it might be met really inconsistently. So there might be a parent, for example, who sometimes is able to meet the need and sometimes not for whatever reason. Or it might always be met inappropriately, or almost always met inappropriately, with a response from the parent or the primary carer of frustration or anger or resentment, something negative. And that will do the opposite of what happened in the positive cycle. So trust isn't built, mistrust occurs, and attunement doesn't happen. And actually, the baby feels that they're not attuned to their primary carer, and that causes distress and stress in the baby. And the results of disturbed attachment at the extreme end of the spectrum, where a baby and a child has received an abusive response or a neglectful response, can be an attachment disorder, disordered attachment. And that can actually end up with some symptoms that look very like some of the things that children are being diagnosed with in terms of additional needs. So the symptoms or the behaviours that can occur through very disturbed attachment, very insecure attachment, can be not wanting to rely on other people, not giving eye contact, avoiding interaction with other people, trying to do everything themselves. It can end up looking a bit like autism. It can end up with a child wanting to put themselves right in front of adults at all times, wanting to be very visible, even through quite negative behaviour. Um, that can look rather like ADHD in a young child. So it's always worth considering a child's attachment at the very beginning of just recognising that a child doesn't seem to be behaving in a very typical manner. Their development doesn't look quite like the other children, and maybe concerns are being raised. I'll give you an example of this. So the EDIT team, as you know, exists to support children with special educational needs and disabilities at the EYFS stage. And that is where we would normally be working. But settings right now can ask for a targeted support visit. We have some funding for that. And myself or one of the team can go in and see a child that a setting is a bit concerned about and give some advice and maybe model some strategies just as a kind of one-off piece of work. And I was recently called in because the setting was very worried about a little boy whose behaviour, although he'd been with them some while, he'd gone into the older room in their setting and his behaviour seemed to have really deteriorated. He wasn't relating well to the other children and was finding sharing impossible, transitions from one activity to another impossible. There were constant sort of struggles, tantrums, battles with other children. When staff were intervening, they were sometimes being hit out at or kicked or shouted at or whatever. He was a very verbal little boy, but in these moments of rage, essentially, there was no reasoning with him. And staff were beginning to say, I just wonder whether he might be autistic. Could you come in? Could you give us some advice? So I went in to see this little one, but actually something had happened in the intervening times. Things had got much worse in a few days, and they'd actually moved him into a quieter room in the nursery. So he was in a room with few other children, and he had a member of staff who was really looking out for him specifically. And he seemed to have calmed down an awful lot in that room, although I could see that he was getting agitated by certain things. He certainly didn't like other children in his space or around his toys. But what I noticed was the member of staff who was working with him had come to the situation fresh, so she wasn't tired by it all, and struggling to kind of maintain a positive attitude because it was kind of quite new to her. And she was doing something instinctively, which is something that I'm trained in as an adopter, and it's something called PACE. So it stands for playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. And it's something that you might be taught to do to help a child who perhaps is struggling with some sort of trauma background. And this member of staff was quite instinctively doing this. So she was keeping her tone of voice quite light. She wasn't coming down and doing a really authoritative or lecturing or disciplinarian tone of voice. She was keeping her voice quite light. And she was accepting the emotions behind this little boy's actions, even when the actions were quite difficult and a bit negative. She was accepting that there were some feelings causing those actions, and she was being curious about what might be causing them. And she was being empathic about what was going on for him. So, for example, he was sat at a table and he wanted all the bricks, and another child was trying to take some bricks to build with, and he was getting really increasingly upset and stressed about that, and was trying to gather all the bricks together and was beginning to shove and push. And the way that she related to him was something like this. She was saying, I can see that you want all the bricks, and I know that it feels like it's difficult to share them. And I'm wondering whether you really want to get your tower very, very tall. And it is annoying, isn't it, when you can't get all the bricks, but we do have to share them. So what we could do is let's put all these bricks this way and then all those bricks over there, and then you've each got a pile that you can build from. Let's do it like that. So she kept her voice very light. She did give a boundary, so he wasn't going to have all the bricks. She was going to make sure that the other child had plenty. But she was accepting that he had some strong feelings about it, and she was curious about why he might be feeling like that, that he really wanted to achieve his aim of building up his tower. And she was empathic that, you know, it is difficult to share sometimes. And that response was really perfect for that little boy, because I think what it was that um, it gave him the indication that this member of staff really liked him. She was for him. She was trying to understand. And he didn't end up with more shame. So I think what had begun to happen in the other room is that staff had begun to get a bit frustrated with his behaviour and had started using quite disciplinarian tone with him and getting a bit cross with him. He was a very verbal child, so they were using quite a lot of words with him, and the words had quite a cross tone to them. And what I felt as I was watching was that it was possible that he really had quite a lot of inner feelings of not being a very good boy, being ashamed of himself. And then as people were getting cross with him, that was being reinforced. Now, that's something that happens with disturbed attachment. Attachment theory would say that a child who has disturbed attachment, so their crying as a baby hasn't been responded to appropriately, and maybe they've received frustration or anger or neglect, then what they will internalize is a sense of shame and a sense of I am bad. Whereas if a child is secure in their attachment, they will have a sense of I am good. If you've got a child with insecure attachment and their sense is I am bad, then that is going to really impact their response to the way that we try to intervene if there's a problem. So rather than being quite disciplining of this little boy, the fact that this member of staff was quite playful with him, kept her tone quite light, and really indicated to him through her facial expressions and the liveliness of her face that she was engaged with him and she liked him. That really helped him to move forward. And actually, this little boy has not gone on to receive a diagnosis of any specific special educational needs or disability. I think what everybody working with him now recognises is that for whatever reason, his level of attachment has been a bit disturbed, and what needs to happen for him is this kind of response, and that will enable him to stay much more level. There are very, very much fewer problems around the way that he is responding to other children or to adults or to situations now. And I think that's to do with the change of approach and understanding that this little boy doesn't have a secure sense of himself and his own value. Now, this is a little bit of a difficult subject to approach, I think, because so my background in attachment is as an adopter, and I know a lot of families who've adopted and adopted children, and the backgrounds that the children come from are not necessarily particularly happy ones or positive ones. That's why they've been in the care system and they've subsequently been adopted. And it's easy to recognise that attachment is going to be a factor. But it feels a little bit as though we're sort of making some sort of judgment, doesn't it, if attachment isn't secure for a child. But I think it can happen for a really wide variety of reasons. And I think attachment, like lots of things, is a bit of a spectrum. And I think, attachment can be mildly or moderately disturbed for reasons that are not to do with parents not wanting the absolute best for their children, wanting to be the best parents that they can. But imagine in a child's early days, lots of things can happen. A parent can lose their job, um, their own parents can be unwell or die, a family member can be unwell or pass away. There can be all sorts of pressures on a family. There can be medical pressures. A mother obviously can be themselves suffering from postnatal depression or something of that nature. There can be all sorts of pressures from other children within the family not responding well to the new baby or having their own issues going on. And there can be lots of reasons why a baby may receive a response from their parent that's a bit inconsistent because of the pressures of life. I'm not really talking, I'm absolutely not talking about this happening just on the odd occasion, which it does for us all, but when it happens repeatedly, but it can happen repeatedly to the best of us potentially, because life is sometimes very difficult. Sometimes having a baby for a parent is not what they thought it was going to be, and it's a huge adjustment. So I think attachment can get disturbed to some level, maybe more often than we recognise. And when a child has additional needs as well, I think that's something to consider even more, in that I expect all of us know parents who have said about their autistic child, I knew there was something different from 2 months, 6 months, a year old. I knew they were different. I knew they were different from their siblings, or I knew they were different from my friends' children, or I just knew there was something different, and now they're diagnosed with autism. It makes complete sense. Parents identify often that their child didn't respond in a typical way, even from the earliest times. And what does that mean for a parent? It means that they are in rather uncharted territory. So perhaps they've got other children and they're used to smiling at a baby at a certain age, and that baby will smile back. They're used to having those people games and a baby will respond. Supposing that baby doesn't give that response back because of an additional need like autism, that affects a parent's level of attunement with their child. However much they tried not to let it affect it, it does, because if we're not autistic, we're wired to seek a response. We're certainly wired to seek a response from our baby or our young child. And when we don't get that response back, that affects our attunement. And you might think that that's only affecting the parent, but it's not. It will also affect the child, because although an autistic baby, an autistic child may be showing it differently, they still want attunement with other people. It may not be presenting itself, that want may not be presenting itself in a typical way. But I mean, I have an autistic brother. It's incredibly important to him that we understand him, that we love him, that we support him. But he doesn't show us his love, his understanding, and his support in the same way that we show it to him. And yet, us showing it to him is very important to him. He has a social communication difficulty, and therefore we have to learn the ways in which he shows his support back to us. But for a parent in early days, when they don't quite know what's going on for their child, there's no diagnosis yet, their child is very, very young, that attunement cannot be, sometimes is not happening as well as it might. So when a child comes into your setting and they have a social communication difficulty, they're diagnosed with autism, or they may be on the way to an autism diagnosis, as well as that special educational need, they may also have significant attachment needs, and building attachment with them is going to be important. Now, that's not going to happen in the same way as for the verbal little boy who was understanding language well at the nursery that I visited. pace, which is a verbal strategy, was perfectly appropriate for him. But for a non-verbal child with autism or social communication difficulty, that's not going to be something verbally that makes sense to them. And yet still keeping the playful, engaged face and manner is going to be important, even when they're doing things that you don't want them to do. Using a face that is has become quite flat or quite disapproving, that's not going to build attunement. So better not to use that disapproving face, but to seek a positive alternative to what they're doing. Because actually, maybe the thing that they're doing which isn't what you want them to do, like maybe climbing up on a table or maybe pushing another child or whatever, it's not what you want them to be doing, and yet they're not doing it to behave badly. They're doing it through a lack of understanding or just a sensory impulse or whatever. So giving them an alternative is going to work much better than a kind of in any way disapproving manner, because shame can be present for that child just as much as for the child who's kind of verbalizing that to us. So for a child with a social communication difficulty who comes into your setting, or a diagnosis of autism or on the way to a diagnosis of autism, the sort of strategies that we go on to talk about in the support strategies toolkit, like intensive interaction, like owling, observe, watch, listen, like really paying attention to their sensory needs and thinking about heavy work and what sensory items you can bring in to help them regulate, like using the Curiosity Programme approach. All of these things are really good also for building attachment. So we'll go on to train on those things in later sessions, but you can read about them in the toolkit right now. And then the third way that I think attachment shows itself in our settings is where there's been medical issues for a child. So another little one that I have seen quite recently actually had a prolonged hospital stay as a just under 1-year-old. I've seen other children who've been in and out of hospital for procedures that are to do with nasogastric tubes or to do with peg feeding or to do with different interventions for cerebral palsy or whatever. If you've got children like that where there's frequent hospital visits and procedures or there's a prolonged hospital stay, it's worth thinking about attachment in that context. And the little one that I went to see, she's on my caseload because of other issues. But the thing that was worrying her nursery most of all was she was finding it really difficult to separate from mum. And then also once she was in nursery, she'd identified a particular member of staff and she wanted to sit on them all the time or be held by them all the time. And the nursery were worried about that and were wanting to know how to move it forward. And in actual fact, the conversation that we had was that this little one is quite appropriately wanting to use that member of staff as her secure base, because actually during the time when attachment was forming and progressing, so that if you think about a toddler or a crawler, baby crawling or toddling, they will crawl away from a parent if they're securely attached, go get a toy and maybe come back again, or they might toddle out of the room and then come back again, and they'll want to find that parent still where they were because they want to come back to their secure base. And if a child is not securely attached, they may want to stay very close to the person that they're wanting to be attached to, their primary carer, in any given situation because they want to make sure that they're not going to go anywhere. So their attachment hasn't developed to that exploratory stage where they go off and come back, go off and come back. And I think the reason it hadn't happened for this little girl is partly COVID, in that COVID shut down all of our toddler groups or the play dates that you might have in somebody else's house, where children might be playing and going off and exploring and then coming back and finding mum again. Obviously none of those have happened. Mum has been in situ at home, so there's been much less exploring by a little one. But then also a long hospital stay has meant that that little one has been in bed, and maybe mum has been right by the bedside. And then maybe there have been times when mum has had to go, or parents have had to do things in shifts because there are other children to be cared for, or that parent can't pick the child up and soothe them for medical reasons, or maybe the parent isn't the one to feed them. So if that's happened at a crucial point in attachment development, then that can set a child back and leave them very nervous and insecure just at the point where they're launching into a nursery setting and actually they're expected to have a slightly more independence. So really the way that the nursery and I spoke about it was that this member of staff is going to be that secure base for this little girl for a while longer. And actually they're going to claim some additional funding to increase ratios in her room, so that she can have that secure base, and that member of staff is going to encourage her to move away. So they're going to put toys at a distance that she might like and encourage her to go and get them and bring them back. And they're going to try and make that process happen naturally, but giving her that secure sense of that member of staff is going to just stay in one place and she's going to be able to return to them to build up attachment. And at the same time sort of talking to mum in those terms as well about what might be able to happen at home. So attachment, I think, is affecting our children with additional needs in quite significant ways, and it's possibly one of the first things to consider when you're thinking about the plans that you're making, the ways that you're trying to work with the children in your care. And you can read much more about the theory of attachment in our EDIT support strategies for Inclusion Toolkit